Hello and welcome to Current Affairs on JTV. Today I'm joined by Hillel Neuer, who is Executive Director of UN Watch, a human rights NGO based in Geneva. Hillel, thank you for joining me today. Let me start with a provocative question. Does your job actually matter? What's the UN's role in all this international system? It seems to me that some people treat it with contempt, that watching it doesn't seem to actually solve any problem.
Well, Alan, maybe the people that you hang out with treat it in contempt, but the truth is that most people around the world consider the United Nations to be credible. According to the Pew Global Opinion Survey a few years ago, they surveyed public opinion in the UK, France, Germany, the United States, and other major democracies, and they found that 50, 60 to 70% of the population of these major democracies consider the United Nations to be credible and authoritative. And the truth is that in Europe, and even where I grew up in Canada, when most people read the headlines and they see the United Nations Human Rights Council declared, for most people it's like gospel. They imagine that the men and women making these decisions are wearing long white robes, strolling along Mount Olympus, making their decisions based on facts, logic, and morality, when you and I know that nothing could be further than the truth, when the fact is that the current members of the Human Rights Council are China, Russia, Cuba, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. But you
think that's still true today? You think that with all that goes on in the world today, with all the fake news and everything else that we see happening on a regular basis, you think the UN is still held in that esteem?
Yes, certainly in Europe, when the United Nations makes a decision, it has the imprimatur, the unique imprimatur of international legitimacy, despite critics that exist. I think many people don't know the facts behind many of these decisions. And the fact is that we know that the UN decisions matter by how countries act. When I sit at the Human Rights Council, and when resolutions are discussed on a given country, when we even try to mention any country, whether it's China, Russia, Cuba, Saudi Arabia, we see the enormous diplomatic, political, even economic resources that they deploy. Once Ireland gave a speech that mentioned China or supported some initiative that was going to criticize China. And the Chinese immediately picked up the phone and said, we have a deal to buy Irish beef. And they said, we're going to think twice about that deal. And it was headlines in the Irish newspapers. So the fact is that countries, the worst regimes, deploy significant resources to make sure they are never so much as mentioned, let alone put in a condemnatory resolution. So the fact is that when countries are named and shamed on the international scene, it erodes their international legitimacy, and particularly those countries that lack any real legitimacy, that are not elected in free and fair elections, don't want an international body pointing out their severe defects.
That, of course, makes sense from the point of view of dictatorships, authoritarian states, but we know that there's a particular problem with Israel at the UN. And now it falls foul, obviously, of being a small state, where big states hold sway, but also by virtue of being ganged up upon by a whole host of other countries in that way. Should a country like Israel want to be part of the UN even? I mean, what do you think Israel's attitude towards this very difficult system needs to be?
Well, Israel is, as you indicated, in a unique position. No other country is condemned as Israel is. The condemnations are not the consequence of genuine concern for human rights, but are a rather overt and clear instance of selective concern, a political tool, a cudgel with which to batter Israel, launched as a campaign over 4 decades now by the Arab and Islamic states, once supported by the Soviet Union, now supported by other dictatorships. And so the dilemma facing Israel is, do we cooperate in a trial where the verdict is declared in advance, really a Stalinist show trial where they have the giant UN logo at the General Assembly, Israel in the dock is the accused, and the language, the theater, uses the language of international law and human rights when those using that language are themselves the worst violators. So the dilemma facing Israel is, do we cooperate in this false trial? And some want Israel not to cooperate and say, this damages our pride. How could we cooperate in something that damages our dignity? And it's a difficult situation facing Israel. The fact is that in 1948, when Israel was declared, it was admitted to the United Nations in 1949. It was
created by the United Nations.
It was, I would say it was created by the Israelis themselves, but certainly you're right that the international mandate in 1947, November 29, 1947, the United Nations declared its support for a Jewish state, absolutely. And in those early years, Abba Eban, who was Israel's glorious representative in those first decade of its existence, fought very hard to get that UN resolution to declare a Jewish state, and then 2 years later to get Israel admitted into the UN. It is the sine qua non of any independent nation to be present at the United Nations, to have a seat. That's why every country, whether it's Kosovo or pick your country, or the Palestinians, they want to be a state. So there's no easy solution for Israel. Some say, oh, let's just leave the UN. That doesn't solve the problem. If there's international hostility, it's manifest in other bodies. You'll have it in FIFA to kick Israel out of the International Football Association. I believe Israel should be present at the UN despite everything that's thrown against it. It doesn't have to participate in every procedure if it's the Durban Racism Conference and so forth. But Israel should be there to make its case because walking away doesn't really solve the problem.
It doesn't. I'm curious, a number of things you said over there. You said there's an excessive focus on Israel. It's the only state that's repeatedly condemned. But you'll accept Israel does commit human rights abuses.
Of course, like every other country, yes.
Okay, so your issue isn't that Israel's a perfect state, it doesn't commit human rights abuses. The issue is the unfair focus on Israel. But let's look at how that should manifest itself. Are you suggesting, therefore, that the UN should be spending as much or more time on other countries as Israel, or do you think they should be ramping down on Israel if it's not prepared to speak about other countries?
I think the UN should apply a methodology that has some logic and consideration for the victims. It should have a human rights consideration. So at the Human Rights Council, we meet for 3 months a year, September, March, and June. There's only a few days that are actually devoted to adopting resolutions. And I think those who are in charge ought to pause for a moment and think, where are there the worst violations happening in the world, and where are there the most victims? Well, China has 1/5 of the world's population denied any form of basic human right, free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, all trampled in China. And so you'd think that they might sit when they gather and decide how they're going to allocate their 2 or 3 days that they do on resolutions, that 1,300,000,000 people might deserve a resolution. That, I think, would be a logical way of proceeding. Or Syria, where hundreds of thousands are being killed. Instead, if there's a handful of people, if there's one person, I remember one terrorist, when I first arrived in Geneva in 2004, in March, one terrorist had been assassinated by Israel. He was the Osama bin Laden of Israel. He was the Hamas founder, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. And there was a special emergency session devoted to effectively a eulogy for Ahmed Yassin. Whereas there are places, 10,000 civilians have been killed in Yemen, primarily by Saudi Arabia. There hasn't been one emergency session, not one commission of inquiry, not one resolution. So I think the answer is absolutely Israel should be held to account. And countries normally, if there is genuine scrutiny being applied, are only enhanced and strengthened by independent outside voices like the UN. The problem is that the UN's treatment of Israel is not only excessive, but it's designed only to demonize. The UN should be allocating its resources in some kind of logical manner to help the victims. They're not doing that at all.
There's a lot of should in what you're saying. The UN should do this, the UN should do that, but it's not going to do that, is it? Because it's fundamentally a political construct, and the politics don't match the ideology in terms of what you've been saying. So given the reality of this situation, what should those people who are genuinely concerned about human rights do? Should there be a movement to set up a parallel organisation to the UN?
That failed. There were attempts. I mean, two things happened. One is Kofi Annan in the year 2005 said the Human Rights Commission is failing. This was after Muammar Gaddafi's murderous Libyan regime was elected to be chair of the Human Rights Commission, which existed for 60 years. Kofi Annan said this is a failure. We should scrap it and create a new body made up of members that actually care about human rights. And so in 2006, we scrapped the old commission and created the new and improved Human Rights Council. So we did have a reform, but sadly the UN being what it is, they elected the same countries once again, and the membership today is the worst that it's ever been. Today, as we meet, 62% of the Human Rights Council are non-democracies.
So that's my point.
There should be an effort to do an outside body that's not the UN. So in the United States, there was talk of that. Actually, Senator McCain, when he ran against Obama in 2008, mentioned the idea of a League of Democracies. And the efforts that have been tried in that end have not succeeded. The United States in the 1990s had something called the Community of Democracies. It still exists, but it has no traction. The European Union is not going anywhere in terms of devoting resources outside the UN. So there's no real support.
So we're doomed to inertia.
We're doomed to have the UN, and it's our job to make it work as best as we can. And that means that European countries, which too often are complicit in many of the bad things that happen in the UN, they're complicit in electing China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. They're complicit in voting against Israel and diverting UN resources. They need to step up to the plate and change their ways.
Hillel, that's all we've got time for today. So thank you very much for joining me. Thank you all at home for joining us as well. We'll see you again soon for another episode of Current Affairs on JTV.